just a couple of stages in the spread of Islam. So can everybody see Mecca and Medina? So that shows where Islam got started, and that shows you about how far away Medina is, where Muhammad had to flee when he was not popular in Mecca, because he was saying all these other temples for worshiping various gods are not right. There's only one God, and you have to worship that God. So when he got into political troubles and he fled to Medina, Medina is the first city where he established a system where his revelations from God, the new religion, Islam, became actually the political organization of the city. So the laws of Islam were the laws of the city. So that was the first place, and now there are many places in the world where that's the case. He did get back to Mecca, and online, if you look at your Moodle site, I have maps of the growth of Islam, and basically this map, which is 16th and 17th century, shows one period where Islam was very widespread. Earlier, Islam had been in Spain. It had gone all the way up into here. And but the other countries of Europe had pushed back Islam. So by the time we get to the 16th and 17th centuries, Islam is not in this part of the world, but look how far Islam is into Eastern Europe. Here's Vienna, and Islam is a political and religious force very strongly as far as Budapest and Vienna and that part of the earth. And also notice how far it's extending in this direction. So this is there are various empires. The pink one is the Ottoman Empire, probably the most famous of the various empires of Islam. The Safavid Empire is going in this direction. The Mughal Empire in India. So this is by the 16th and 17th century. Islam is the dominant religion this far into the east. And that kind of explains how Islam got even further into countries like Indonesia, where it's the most populous country, the country with the most Muslims on the earth today. So this is just a good map that I found by flipping pages there to give you a sense of the extent of Islam. But let's look at the veil in Islam, study guide 28, and look at the Quran and some of the things that the Quran actually says relating to any kind of veiling or modesty. The main teaching is in Surah 24, verses 30 to 31, which is a statement about how both men and women should be modest. So in verse 30, it starts out by saying, "Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty." How about that? I don't think the Bible ever tells men to guard their modesty, but the Quran is thinking about that. So that will make for greater purity for them, and Allah is well acquainted with all that they do. Next verse, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty." So the language so far is exactly the same for both genders. Then it continues that they should not display their beauty and ornaments, except what ordinarily would appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, so that could be stepsons, their brothers, or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, or the slaves, or the male servants, free of sexual needs. What would that be? Male servants free of sexual needs. There's a term called eunuchs. There's a a term for men who have been, it's like a dog gets spayed. So in some cultures in the past, that was a practice. If a ruler had trusted household servants that were going to be around his family, he might prefer to have male servants who were not going to be a sexual threat to him and to his wives. So there is this practice of being a eunuch. So anyone who is kind of desexed. So anyway, that's what's referred to in that line. So this is a very, and then it says, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex. And then so this is a huge list of all the people that you can be freely around, that you don't have to worry about having to veil or having any kind of modesty worries. The last line says, and also, so all this is about drawing a veil over your bosoms. So like not having too high a profile, or not being the way we would ordinarily see a lot of kids today. I remember when my daughters were teenagers, and this is about 10 or 15 years ago, and it probably is still true now, but in high school it was really the fashion to go to school with about 6 inches of your midriff showing. And I was always arguing with them, saying, no, this is not appropriate. So they could kind of hunch things up or down and make more or less. But at least in the 7th century, in Muhammad's time, he's saying, no, veil over the sexy parts of your body. But then the translation of the word veil is also going to be an issue. But the other interesting thing is that the last line of that says, besides drawing a veil and not displaying your beauty, that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments. So actually that tells you that a woman could be totally modestly dressed, but she might have some bangles around her ankles. And if she's walking around with those bangles clinging and clanging, that's specifically mentioned, don't do that. So it's kind of amusing how detailed it is. But the last line summarizes it. It says, and O you believers, turn altogether toward Allah, that you may attain bliss. Marry those among you who are single, or the virtuous ones among your slaves, male or female. If they are in poverty, Allah will give them means out of His grace, for Allah encompasses all and He knows all things. So this is one of the 2 passages, there's only 2 in the Quran, that relate to any covering of women. The word that's translated veils is actually kumur, and it's not sure exactly what sort of, does it mean head? Here it's mainly saying draw the kumur over the bosoms and not display your beauty. So does that mean hair? Does it mean shoulders and bust area? What does it mean? One thing it does not say is head to toe, make sure not an inch of flesh is showing. Yet, that's how it's interpreted in some places. So what you have is 2 things. You have what the Quran says, actually 3 things. The Quran itself, all the interpretations of the Quran, which we'll also go into perhaps today if the speaker doesn't come, or perhaps next Wednesday if she does. But the third thing that you have is a culture where it's very conservative and men are very controlling and they want to set more restrictions than is in the Quran. So the only other passage that refers to covering comes from a passage where the revelation is speaking directly to Muhammad and telling Muhammad what to do in regard to the modesty of his own wives and daughters. So this is Surah 33, verses 59 to 60. And it begins, O Prophet, tell your wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their jilbab. And so here's another word. It's usually translated cloak. I'm sorry, it's a V. Cast their jilbab, which is usually translated cloak or outer garments, over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such and not molested. So the whole purpose of this passage is when his family, the women of his family, are outside of the household, that they not be molested. And interesting that it doesn't say all Muslim women. It's specifically his family, and it's for the status of his family and preserving the honor of his family. But guess what? Other men want to have status and honor too. And actually, so they're saying, well, my wife should be covered also when she's out of the house. And another phenomenon is that in the 6th and 7th century, your average poor woman laborer wasn't going to be wearing a veil or any modesty covering when she's out doing farming and doing just errands, or probably selling in the marketplace or doing things like that. But the higher class women did. They were protecting their modesty and also just expressing their social status by the wearing of a veil. So if the upper class is doing it, other people want to do it. So what originally began as a sign of distinction for a social class, and Muhammad here is being advised to protect his women in his family and from molestation and from other outside observance by having them have an outer cloak of some kind. But what began as a social status and a protection today is being interpreted as a sign of your loyalty to Islam, and it's widespread belief that it's in the Quran, but it's not. It's only specifically to Muhammad's family, and then the modesty issue, especially to keep the bust area somewhat covered. So those are the two references, and when we get our speaker here, she will continue to explain the issue of the veil in Islam. One phenomenon of the veil in recent history, like the last 100 years, is that Westerners have come into places and said, we're going to liberate you women, so you don't have to wear veils. In fact, you can't wear veils. And not wearing a veil is a sign that you're loyal to the Western culture that has come in here. This especially happened in Algeria, in North Africa, when the French were ruling that part of the world. So the French said no veils. And I don't know how widespread it was before that. It's supposed to be an individual woman's preference and how she wants to observe her faith and the Quran. But as soon as the French said, because of our Western outlook, we want you to not wear the veils, then Muslim people said, well, in order to show our loyalty to our culture and our background, we're going to wear the veil. And if a woman herself didn't make that choice, it became an issue within her family. So to show the status and the religion of her family, the devoutness of her family, she might be asked or told by her husband, wear the veil. You're essentially wearing the flag for our religion. So this, when feminists look at this issue of the veil, what they say is that woman's body has become a battleground, with the liberated Western side saying, don't wear the veil, and the conservative side saying, yes, wear the veil. So it becomes not her own choice, but her having to show by her dress what the allegiance of her entire family is. So that's when she has less freedom. And because it has become such a political issue, she doesn't, in some parts of the world, she doesn't have that choice. So, then we get groups like the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan and saying, okay, we're gonna have covering head to toe because we're gonna be really strict about our observance of not only the Quran, because the Quran never says head to toe covering, but of Shari'ah law. So it looks like we're going to get to continue with our lecture of Shari'ah law. I wonder if she and I miscommunicated and she thought it was next Wednesday, or if she's just, held up her traffic or something like that. And I didn't bring a phone to call her, but I think I'll just let it go for next Wednesday. So let's continue and look at Shari'ah law now. That's a concept we haven't looked at. So we've already discussed in class study guides 18 and 19, which are just the introduction to Islam and to the life of Muhammad, and 19, which is basic practices within Islam, like the 5 pillars, the things that you need to do to make sure that you pray 5 times a day, that you make a pilgrimage to Mecca, that you do charity work, that you witness for your faith, which is probably why she's willing to come and talk to us today, because it's one of the 5 things you're supposed to do, is proclaim your faith, especially when asked. And what is the last one? Pray 5 times a day? Look that up. The fasting in the month of Ramadan. So those are the 5 things that you need to do to be a good Muslim. So those are study guides 18 and 19. I'll just mention at this point study guide 20, where we notice that in the Muslim Holy Scripture, the Quran, there's no actual name for Adam or Eve. They're not named characters, and actually I think Adam is named, but Eve is not. Let me just look at my study guide. The name Eve never appears. She's just called the first woman, the mother. And of course, there is no passage where he's put to sleep and split into 2 and she comes out of a rib or anything like that. So it's much more equal in the Quran. We talked about that a little bit. The problem is that in later writing, people who are commenting on the Quran, because they honor the Christian scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures, they're commenting on Adam and Eve as if the name of Eve was also in the Bible, in their Quran, and they're saying that Eve was taken out of Adam and Adam was there first, and they're saying not only that she was taken out of a rib, but I think I mentioned this to you earlier, that I heard Rifat Hassan speak about some of the misogyny that's out there in the interpretation of the Quran and the Bible that you can hear even among Muslims. So you can hear people saying, oh, it was the left rib. She wasn't made out of the right rib, she was made out of the left rib. When there's not even a rib in the Quran. And then you hear people saying, oh, it was not only the left rib, but it was a crooked rib. So this kind of snowballing and exaggeration comes about from cultural sources and from commentary on the Quran and the Bible and the Hebrew scriptures. So even though the Quran is better on the subject of the first humans, that doesn't mean that all of Muslim culture has escaped from some of the prejudices and misinterpretations that have cropped up in Christianity and have influenced Islam. So that was study guide 20. Let's turn now to study guide 21. And please print this off of the Moodle site if you haven't already done that. We've already gone over the first page of that study guide, which points out that the word mentioned for creation in the Quran, verses Surah 4, verse 1, and it's actually called ayat. I don't know if, this is not really a vocabulary word you need to know, but each verse is called an ayat. So in Surah 4, verse 1, we talked about the word actually being used to describe creation being nafs, N-A-F-S. So in some translations where it says God created all of humans from a single person or a single being, it definitely is not from any kind of a male word. We talked about being created from a single nafs, definitely a non-gendered word. So they're created equal and simultaneously. And we also mentioned that this word is similar to the Hebrew nephesh, which just means soul, or actually it can even go as far as being body, body and soul together, because Hebrew doesn't separate body and soul the way that Greek philosophy does. And we talked about the word beat and the possible correct translations of that word in Surah 434. Let's now look at the ways that Muslims figure out how to live in the world today. So of course they're going to look at the Quran, right? So let's put the Quran out there as the core of Muslims figuring out how does God want me to live. This is the source of the answer to that question. However, within Islam, other texts developed of commentary. Just like on the Torah, you've got the Talmud, and you've got centuries of commentary being added onto that. Within Christianity, you've got not just the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, but you've got all the church fathers' commentaries. And Augustine saying things like, sex is good only if it's meant to make babies. If you're having sex in marriage and it's not intending to make a baby, then you're sinning. So all this commentary that gets added onto the Holy Scriptures. So within the Quran, the other texts that are influential are the Hadith and the Sunnah and various other tafsir, and that's their word for interpretation. And also all put together, all of those elements are put together to form the Shari'ah, which is the Islamic law. So I'm just going to mention these. So I'll write them on the board as other bodies of writing that are influential. So the Hadith is the quotations from Muhammad. The Quran is just whatever he got pretty directly from God, but when you look at it, it's not quite so direct. It's God's mind to an angel, to his mind, and him then going home and reciting it word for word to someone who wrote it down. So there's a few steps in the processing of actually getting the Quran. But in addition to the Quran, you've got everybody who's collecting anything Muhammad says as he gains status and authority in his community. So if he says, this is how I handle things in my marriage, or this is how you should handle a legal situation, or in war you should do this, or when you pray you should do this or that, everything he said got written down. And if it didn't get written down during his lifetime, it got orally passed down. So maybe 50 years after he died, somebody wrote it down. Or 100 years after he died, after it had been passed from one generation to the next generation. So then you get a question of how accurate are these hadith? So this is you can say within a couple hundred years after the Quran is written, all of these sayings of Muhammad are written down. Then you've got the Sunnah, which is not just the sayings of Muhammad, but the different anecdotes of things he did. Like when he had a problem with this, he did that. Or when he wanted to know about how to handle this, he got this message from God. So there are various little short stories as well as a few sayings. So this is the Sunnah. This is what Muhammad said, but mostly what he did. Let's see. So little anecdotes and stories and a few sayings. So these are getting collected for a couple hundred years after the death of Muhammad. So can anybody tell me when was Muhammad born, in what century? Great, 6th century. I heard a whisper anyway. 6th century, Muhammad is born. And when is he dying? 7th century, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Approximately. You've got to remember these things, at least for a few more weeks until the final exam, right? 632. He didn't live that long. And his first revelation was in 610. So it's a 22-year period that he's getting these revelations from God, going into a cave, and sometimes after the first few, he will go up to the mountain and pray and bring a question before God and say, what should I do about this problem? And sometimes he would get an answer and sometimes not. But when he did get an answer, he would listen, remember it, go home and recite it. So anyway, so let's say 700, 800. So for 200 years after his death, that would take us to 830s or 850. What we're trying to do is figure out how we got Sharia law. How we got Sharia, which is actually redundant if you say law. But basically, the Quran, the things Muhammad said, the things Muhammad did, and you've got a whole nother body of writing, which is tafsir, which just means interpretation. So within Christianity, interpretation of the Bible is called hermeneutics. I don't know if we really covered that word, but Hermes was a messenger. And people who are trying to look at the Holy Scripture and pull out the message and find out what the message is, they're doing hermeneutics. Within Islam, does anybody within Islam, it's called tafsir. Does anybody remember the name within Judaism for interpretation of Scripture? When you're working on trying to figure it out and writing down meanings. It's called midrash. So these are all different words for the same process, where you're trying to figure out what the Quran is really saying and how to interpret it, how to understand it. So I'll erase these now, so don't get confused. But that's what tafsir means, is interpretation. And so the final area then for deciding how God wants us to live today, you've got the Quran, you've got the sayings, you've got his life, you've got the commentary. Today, you not only have these four things, but you have Shari'ah. So originally, people just had the Quran and they had Muhammad's leadership. Then they had these sayings and Sunnah and various commentaries. For the first 400 years after Muhammad's death, up to the year 1200, they were studying all of these things, and there were different schools. There were 4 different schools, 4 different cities with 4 different collections of scholars saying, all of this should amount to this kinds of laws in our cities, in our culture. Another city would say, no, all of this should amount to slightly different and slightly different. So there are 4 versions of the actual laws that you should have that would accurately reflect the Quran and the sayings and the life and all the interpretations. So for instance, should a woman wear a veil or not today? When they were forming Sharia law, there were different disagreements on exactly what that would come down to, and whether another example is, should you stone someone or should you confine someone for adultery? So there are different interpretations. The Quran never says stoning, but somehow, from various other sources, the idea of stoning was hard to get rid of, and it still exists in the law today in some Muslim countries. So for about 200 years, they were still writing down Sunnah and Hadith. They had scholars who were traveling around to different parts of the Muslim world and saying, oh, did your family have any quotations or memories of what Muhammad said and did? And if so, we'll write them down. But then they had, toward the end of that 200 years, they had people going around and saying, we want to verify this. We want to make sure that what you're reporting as a saying or a anecdote involving Muhammad's life and his choices, we want to make sure that's accurate. So they were separating them out and saying, these are the actual ones that we think are right and these are legend. So there were a lot of scholars that were working on this in the couple hundred years after his death. Then we have another couple hundred years where this culture is controlling a lot of the world. The Muslim culture is as far as Spain, and it's controlling all this area, and it has both political power and religious power. So they have to have laws, right? They have to figure out how to do things. So they formed laws, and there were these 4 schools that had 4 different slightly versions of various laws to have. By the year 1200, the 4 schools stopped squabbling with each other. There was actually a caliph or a ruler who said, all this disagreement among different schools is not good. We want one unified decision on what we should have for laws in Muslim lands. So they came up with one definitive set of laws. They said, okay, we're going to have it, and we're going to, this set of Shari'ah is going to be what we have for all the laws of all the Muslim countries. But they also added a PS. It can't be changed. Don't argue about it anymore. We've had a couple hundred years of arguing about it, so don't change it. Well, that worked fine for another 100 years or 200 years. But were they thinking about the 21st century when they were saying, no, it can't be changed? Well, now we have a problem today. There are some people who still say, Sharia law cannot be changed. That's what they said. They said, stop arguing over it and don't change it. But there are other people, including a lot of women, who are saying, wait a minute, that worked for the 12th century, but not so much today. So that's where you basically get the debate between authors like Asma Barlas, believing women in Islam, unreading patriarchal interpretations, and the men who are still empowering groups like the Taliban, who are taking the most conservative version. So basically what you need to know for your quiz on Islam as far as this part of the course is you need to be able to tell me what Sharia means. It means Islamic law. It's just another word for it. Yeah, and you often hear Sharia law, which is kind of like, oh, there's a place in Arizona called Sagi Canyon, because the Navajo word for canyon is Sagi. So you're really saying canyon, canyon. But Sharia law is like saying law, law. But anyway, so you need to know what it is. So it's different, for instance, from the word Shia, and from, if we're going to talk about the word Shia, we're going to have to talk about the word Sunni. So Sharia is a set of laws formulated in the several hundred years after Muhammad's lifetime and agreed upon in the 12th century, and not some people don't want it changed even today, and other people say we have to modify it. We are not going to put someone to death for adultery. We're not going to cut off someone's hand for being a thief. But there are others, particularly in the Taliban, who say that's what the law says, that's what we got to do. So that's where you get the disagreement. But just for vocabulary purposes, let's look at the difference between Shari'ah, which is a legal system for Muslim countries, and the word Shia and the word Sunni. Does anybody remember which one is? So there are a lot of Sunni Muslims in the world today, and there are a lot of Shiite Muslims. Does anyone remember which one is the majority? Out of all the, is it 2 million, 2 billion Muslims in the world today, it's about 1/4 of the world's population. Which one is the dominant in terms of just people? Sunni. Okay, so this is 80% of all Muslims today. This is approximately, I'm sure it's got to be very rounded off. This is the minority position. And there are a bunch of others. So we mentioned Sufi Muslims today. Within Shia, there's Alawaki. There are a lot of different varieties. In Syria today, Bashar al-Assad is a type of Shiite Muslim called Alawaki. And so he is a minority within a minority, and he's ruling the country of Syria. But a lot of Shiites are allied with him because they're somewhat similar. So in Syria, you've got discrimination against Sunnis. And anyway, so it gets very political. But which one is connected to the belief that the nephew of Muhammad should have been the next ruler of the Shiites? Okay, so this is the party of Ali. And so this one was the one who felt that his youngest wife, what's her name now? Youngest wife of Muhammad. Back to my notes. Khadija. No, that's his first wife. Aisha. The youngest wife is Aisha. So a lot of people felt that her father, Abu Bakr, should be the next leader. So this is the Abu Bakr group, which actually won out. But a lot of people, the party of Ali was the Shiite Ali. And so they're the Shia Muslims who still regret that the nephew didn't become it. Okay, so those are just the vocabulary words to know the difference when you hear the news, when you're hearing about Shiite Muslims, what their basic position is, and who the Sunni Muslims are. The word Sunni, you might notice, is connected to this word Sunnah, which just means the practices or the habits and the way that Muhammad did things. So Muhammad's practices are his Sunnah. And people who emphasize his practices and abide by his practices are Sunnis, especially if they also wanted Abu Bakr to be the next leader. Okay, so those are the key vocabulary words. Let's notice that if suppose I am a Muslim today and I want to know if I should be, how many times a day I should pray or what I should, well, that would be pretty obvious, but if, pardon?
5.
Pardon?
5.
Yes. Yes. Suppose I'm in an airport and I want to know if I have to pray or not, and I don't have a suitable place, or actually most airports do have a place. But if I have a question about how I'm going to live out my Muslim faith today, what am I going to turn to? Am I going to turn to Shari'ah? That should answer most questions for everybody, unless I don't agree with it, unless it's saying cut off your hand if someone is a thief. But you would think that in Christianity, you would turn to the Bible, right? And in Judaism, you would just turn to the Torah. They very highly respect the Talmud as well. But within Islam, the Quran gets kind of overshadowed by The Sunnah, all the things Muhammad did, his practices and the way he actually handled things. The Hadith, all the interpretations, and then everything codified in the Shari'ah. So what mainly the women scholars for today are saying is, let's bring back the Quran to the main guideline. Let's not just turn immediately to Sharia law, because after all, which one was revealed by God? Sharia law or the Quran? So they're saying, let's look at the Quran. Let's see what the Quran actually says about what women should do and about the origins of the human race, the life after death issues, the divorce and marriage issues, the coverings and the modesty. They said, let's emphasize the Quran. Let's not just say this is the only guideline. So that's one of the big issues within Islam today. So Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas are among those who will say, well, their titles of their books actually reveal it. The Quran and woman. They're not saying Sharia law and woman. Let's turn to Sharia and figure out what we should be doing with the genders. This one says unreading patriarchal interpretations of the Quran. So, in fact, I'll read a quote from her. She says that Asma Barlas has essentially the same chart that I've done on the board for you today. And she says, the Quran's importance for women is magnified by the fact that Muslims believe that the legalization of sexual inequality found in the Sharia, they believe it's in conformity with the Quran's teachings. When actually she says there's a big difference in how the genders are treated in the Quran and in the Sharia. So she says, most Muslims will say, oh, well, this just exactly reflects the Quran. But the problem is, when scholars look at it and they notice the big influence of these other factors, they say, no, it doesn't. Question or comment, Brandon?
Yeah, I was just curious, Professor. I know, like in the Bible, the prophets, like they perform miracles, and those miracles help the people believe, that he had power from God. Did Muhammad ever do anything like that, or did people just
I don't think he did. I don't think he did. And actually, I took a whole course with Mustafa Ruskar called The Quran, and he goes very carefully into how the Quran was revealed, and scholars debating. But the question of why did people believe Muhammad, and did he have to do miracles to show it? I don't believe there were miracles.
I was just curious.
I think it's simply the claim that I heard God. Actually, he doesn't say God. He says, I was in a cave and I heard a voice, and the voice was the voice of an angel. So I think it's simply the strength of the idea of revelation today, and he didn't have to back it up by any miracles. So, that actually relates to issues within the Church of the Latter-day Saints, because they also have an understanding in the 19th century that a book was found that was a more recent revelation from God that should be obeyed. In that case, was there any miracles that were needed to prove that it was, in fact, the Word of God? Do you know, Brendan, or not?
Oh, well, like, people had the evidence of the book, and then
The book itself.
the book itself, and then we believe that the priesthood of God that was given to the ancient apostles was also restored, and it's through the priesthood that blessings where people were healed, whether they were sick or afflicted.
So were there healings in the 19th century that substantiated the authority of the new, what's the name of that book?
The Book of Mormon?
The Book of Mormon. That would be a good name for the book, wouldn't it? So yeah, there is this phenomenon of additional revelations and how to handle them. But in the case of Muhammad, it was his sheer moral power of his message. The first message being recite, "The Lord your God is one," and that is in verse 96. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, in the name of your Lord and Cherisher who created humans, and a little bit of detail, do not obey evil, but bow down in adoration and bring yourself closer to Allah. So actually it doesn't say in that particular line that there is one God, but that some of the future revelations. So simply the moral force of the command, bow down and speak and obey me. And the first person he told about that to was his wife Khadijah, and he got someone to write it down for him, and he started to gain authority through that revelation. Scholars have also noticed two things about why it was accepted. This part of the world did not have a unifying religion to give it political power. So this message of, we have a revelation to our people. It's not just the Jews who got a revelation. It's not just Christianity that got a special prophet or representative of God, literally God who came. But we have the attention of the divine, and God gave us a message. So that had to be pretty popular, even though he was saying a lot of you are out of business if you own a temple for a particular variant of a god that's being worshipped here in Mecca. I think it was the moral force of saying there is only one God, and that power really took root, as well as the need for a political power for that part of the world that ended up unifying empires that lasted for hundreds of years. Any other questions before we close out for today, and hope we can get our visitor, our guest speaker next week. I'll just read another 2 sentences from the study guide that summarize all of this. Early interpreters of the Quran assumed that, so these people doing interpretation, they assumed that however they interpreted each line was exactly right, even though they were being influenced by some of these other texts that were clearly culturally bound with different sexist and gendered orientations, negative views of women, and other cultural biases. So the final thing was when all of these interpretations that were valued almost as highly as the Quran were wrapped up into the Shari'ah. And once that was done and it was said, you can't change it, then that set up the situation we have today of an 1,100-year-old understanding being the governing force for cultures and politics today. Okay, that's all for today.